Holy Spirit, we want more of you.
So welcome to part 3, and in this part we're going to be looking at our thinking process, understanding how we think and the impact that it has. So when we think of our thinking progress, firstly we need to consider the various parts that we use in thinking. And obviously there's the mind, and then there's our brain, and then there's the body. And we looked in the first part, we looked at the connection between those two, and we were looking a little bit more at those connections. So once we have understood how the different parts work and how they work together and the impact that the one has on the other, only then can we begin to manage our thinking, and specifically our toxic thinking or our negative thinking. So in the last parts, we looked at what is the mind. And I said to you that the mind is a spiritual part of us. In other words, we cannot see it, it's not in the carnal realm. And it is part of your soul. So we have our soul there, and the soul consists of our emotional component, how we feel about things, happy, sad, etc. There's our will, our choice, or the word we use is our cognitions, and then there is our mind. So our minds, your mind can be described as your intellect. It's that invisible part that can reason, and this is the important words, it does reflective analysis. So all the time your mind is going to be doing reflective analysis. Even as I'm speaking right now, there will be some reflective analysis going on in your thinking and obviously in your brain. So when we look at the mind, it draws on a number of things when it starts processing information. It draws on the emotions. How did I feel about that? So somebody holding a gun to me in a hold-up, there will be a lot of negative emotions. And the mind is drawing on that emotion for its processing. It also draws on past experiences, what has happened before, how to deal with that incident. And it also draws on a thing which we call our family scripts. So when we come into this world, we've got no idea how to live in this world. And we learn in our family, from our moms, dads, brothers, aunts, uncles, wider family, and in the wider world, how we should think about things, how we should behave, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. And all families have various scripts, i.e., this is what we talk about, this is what we don't talk about. So these 3 aspects is what your mind is drawing on, and this happens while you are both awake or asleep. So your mind is working all the time. So when you look at the mind and you look at the brain, this information that the mind drew on, what are the emotions, past experiences, family scripts, this is now fed into your brain. And your brain processes and starts understanding what has going on. And it starts drawing its own information as well from your subconscious. And we'll explain what the subconscious is in a moment. It draws on memories that it's got stored in the brain, and we'll use the word neural pathways. And it also draws on what the body holds. So one of the things we've got to remember is that our body does also remember. And there's a book by Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps the Score, which talks a lot about that. So your brain is now drawing on this, and then it feeds back into your mind. And so we can see we have this little loop of thinking. But now let's take a little more, a greater depth of look at the mind. So when the brain, apologies. The upper brain, which you can see there, it's this little wrinkly part, is called the neocortex. And the front part over here, which I've circled in red, is called the prefrontal cortex, and it is your consciousness. When you're asleep, that is switched off. Doesn't mean that your mind's not thinking, but you are not conscious. But then you've got all this other big part of the brain called your non-consciousness. And this is where a lot of the processing goes, because within this part, there's a whole lot of neural pathways and bits of information about this, about that. And it is interesting when you look at the processing power of this part of our brain, the non-consciousness. It is processing 1 million bits of information every second. As you are listening to me, your non-conscious part is processing information. It's hearing my words. It's drawing on its past experience, what it's heard, ideas that have been formed, neural pathways that are entrenched ideas of the past, etc. And it's processing this. And this is the interesting part. This information over there, once it's started its processing process, takes from 30 to 90 seconds before it feeds back into your conscious part, your prefrontal cortex, with a thought, with an idea. And this is one of the first points of managing our thinking process, managing our toxic thoughts, is to wait in a conflict situation before we respond. Now, obviously, in normal conversation, you're not going to wait 30 seconds, 90 seconds. But when you are in a conflict situation, it's important to just pause, slow down, let your non-conscious part of your brain process before speaking. So you give it a time to process all the information, and then it comes into your prefrontal cortex as a thought, which you then can speak out. The problem is, if you don't do this, you react out of the situation. And this is often called the regret zone. I'm sure that all of us have had some experience when we said something and afterwards, oh, I shouldn't have said that. That is because we went into this response mechanism in a conflict situation without giving our non-conscious part of our brain a little time to process the information and formulate something as a thought which is helpful for the situation. So when we look at the brain and we look at the front of the brain, we can see there's this divide in the brain over there, and it's the left half and you have the right half. And the left half is the sequential processing part. And obviously the information moves backwards and forwards across these two halves. There's connectors in the cingulate gyrus that connect these two parts, and you think a little bit with the processing part, and then you think a little bit with the emotional part as well. And we go backwards and forwards thinking. Now, this part of the brain is slow reacting. Remember, I said the non-conscious part can take from 30 seconds to 90 seconds to process something and come up with a thought. And it's part of your working memory. And we have a lower brain. And the lower brain reflects back, and that's a very quick part of the brain, which we'll see in a moment, reflects back to our sequential thinking and our emotional processing. And it can be unconscious, subconscious, but it is always active. And this brain is geared for survival. So if something suddenly jumps out at you, it's this part of your brain that will keep you safe. And it responds in 7 milliseconds. And so now you can see that the upper brain, which is taking some 30 to 90 seconds to process information, can quite easily be overridden by the lower brain, and we have the knee-jerk reaction and sometimes saying things that are not useful for the situation. So again, let's looking at the brain, and this is a diagram of the brain, and you've got the top, the neocortex, you've got the limbic system, and you've got the reptilian system. And the limbic and reptilian systems are what we'll call the lower brains. So I'm just going to go through the upper brain, the limbic or mammalian brain, and the brainstem, and the reptilian brain. In fact, your whole nervous system, your whole body is part of the brain system. And the upper brain is the part that the mind uses for reflective analysis, emotional understanding, speech, hearing, sight, all that sort of thing. But your limbic brain or mammalian brain works subconsciously and responds to implicit and pathogenic memories. So quickly, what is an implicit memory? It's a memory that you have learned and is entrenched in your automatic part of your brain so that you can do this task. So you learn to ride a bicycle when you were a kid. You can get on a bicycle now without even thinking about it. That is an implicit memory. Walking is an implicit memory. When we were born, we could not walk. We've learned to walk. Today you walk just naturally. You don't even think about it. You get out of your chair, you go somewhere. That is an implicit memory. The pathogenic memory is the same as that, but it has got negative emotional content. So in other words, if you were subjected to a trauma of a spider falling on you as a small child, that would be a traumatic experience, and that is held as a pathogenic memory in your subconscious brain and will respond whenever you see a spider. Hence, we have people with anacrophobia today. And then the brainstem and the reptilian brain works unconsciously, keeping vital organs functioning. So when you go to sleep, your heart keeps beating, you keep breathing, your body is regulated in temperature, it digests food, it sends messages, I'm hungry, I'm thirsty. That is all part of that basic part of our brain function that keeps us alive and healthy. So as we continue to look at the brain, we have our body. And the body receives sensory information through the sight, the eyes, sound, the ears, touch with a taste, and our smell. If you smelled a burning smell, it would go obviously first into your body through your nose, and then it would go up obviously to your brain. Your body is also responding to implicit memories, traumas, scripts, and experiences, which I shared a little bit earlier. This gets fed up immediately to the lower brain, and that is triggered to keep us safe. So if the smell is smoke, and you recognize it is a fire, you're going to react to manage that situation. Then that is fed up to your upper brain, the sequential thinking or the emotional thinking part of your upper brain. And in the middle is your prefrontal cortex, that part which is your working memory, and that is monitoring your internal landscape, i.e. what is going on over here. And it also monitors our outside landscape or our social world. Is this person coming to me with a knife? Is this car hurtling towards me? So it's monitoring all the time, and this system of reaction is going on all the time. So when we look again at the upper brain, it is that part which is our working memory and all the non-conscious memory, and then we have our lower brain. So you've got the two parts. And the upper brain is our sequential thinking and emotional thinking, as we said before. But I just want to look a little bit at what our lower brain does when it is triggered to react. So it is triggered, we will react automatically, and we go into, and you will recognize these words, into a fight response. So if you were walking along the road, the pavement, and a dog started barking at you, your first reaction is this fight response. Your next reaction is you want to run away, your flight response, especially when it is a dangerous situation that you cannot fight. But then when it gets too overwhelming, we go into what we call a freeze response. This is the rabbit in the headlights, where you just become immobilized and can't react. And then, of course, we can go into what we call our flop response. This is where we shut down, our whole body system shuts down, our brain system shuts down. It's also called fawn. And then there's a touch response. And that is when we start looking for something for comfort. And so when we are triggered by situations and our brain has got a neural pathway, alcohol is the solution to keep me safe or to keep me calm or to get rid of the distress that attach. I need something. The brain will automatically start reaching for the alcohol. Or it could reach for drugs, or it could reach for sex, it could reach for adrenaline sports. It's that thing that the brain is looking for to make us come into a feeling of safety again. It's a very important part, and this obviously affects the upper brain. And now, lastly, I want to just look at our window of tolerance. So we've all got a window of tolerance. How much can we tolerate? Most of us are usually running in the middle of our window of tolerance. Some people have got a wide tolerance. Some people got a very narrow tolerance. Some people have a narrow tolerance to sound. Now, when something happens, a triggering event, and let's just take this experience of this little chap who had a horrible experience with a spider. So this is now an adult, and suddenly a spider falls on his lap. A triggering event is now in action, and that pushes us out of our window of tolerance into the top of our window of tolerance. And when we are in the top of our window of tolerance, we have distorted thinking. We can't think straight. This is where we're in our fight, flight, freeze. And we cannot think logically in that. If we get into that, we have to get ourselves back into the middle of our window of tolerance. The problem is, after that has kind of subsided for a while, we drop to the below our window of tolerance. And this is where our thinking is shutting down. This is where we experience our low mood and depression. This is where we're experiencing our anxiety with all its distorted thinking. I'm going to die. There's something wrong with me. And we have this shutdown, and people in the depressed state are usually somewhere down in the bottom. And as you know, their thinking is not very healthy. So that is just giving us an idea of how our mind and our brain and our body interact. And now we can start looking at the management of our toxic thinking or mental health mind management. So we know how we function. So we have our mind, we have our brain, and we have our body. And what usually will happen for us is that we'll have information. So we have somebody criticizing us. So at a work situation, right, that information goes in, and immediately our brain starts processing both in the non-conscious and the conscious, and our mind starts thinking, I can't, oh no, impossible, etc. The mind then feeds back to the brain feeds back to the body, so we have a response in the body, which can be feeling negative in our bodies, or angry, or a number of emotions, and we have a reaction. So we respond with our mouth, we shout back, and then we have this loop that happens. And so we get into a loop in our thinking. And I don't know if you can remember when you've had a stressful situation, how your mind goes round and round and round trying to get a solution. And that is how we are functioning. So mind awareness is the important thing. Before we can manage our negative thinking, our negative thoughts, our toxic thoughts, we need to be aware of what is happening. So remember, I told you about the prefrontal cortex, which is monitoring our internal system and our external system, our social system, what is happening around us. So that's what we do with our prefrontal cortex. And then we need to capture that. We need to evaluate with our mind, what is going on with me? And we need to see, number one, am I in my window of tolerance? Am I outside my window of tolerance? Or am I at the top of my window of tolerance? And you will quickly pick that up, because your heart is going to be beating faster. Your breath is going to be shallow. You'll probably find a lot of sweating and other emotional distress feelings. We need to monitor what we are thinking. That's the next part. Okay, so what is the thought? I'm no good. I'm terrible. And unless we start capturing that thought, just being aware of it, we cannot even begin to change the way we think. But we can, and I'll show you how later. We need to evaluate the emotional result. Is there feelings I'm going to explode, I want to smash his face in, or do something horrible, or do something horrible to myself? We need to evaluate the emotional result. And then we need to pause before we proceed. This is critical. When we are triggered, it is important to slow down and pause. The more you train yourself to do that, the better you'll be able to manage your thinking process and come up with results that are useful for you and those around you. And I will, in the next talk, give you more skills on how to pause before you proceed. So when we're looking at our mental health mind management, we've got a problem. Our brain is always going to be working. It's always going to be making what we call neural pathways. This is patterns of thinking. It will always create a certain pattern, no matter what is happening, where you think positively or negatively. So you can create a negative a pattern of thinking. I'm not good enough. I can't get it right. I'm useless. Your brain will then default to that. Or you can create a positive neural pathway. I can slow down, I can look at this, and I can work through it, and I can find a solution. If we create that neural pathway, that is how we will function. So whatever happens, your brain is going to start creating these neural pathways, and inevitably something will happen. But if we don't manage our mental health, the following will happen. As I've just said, your brain will develop different thinking patterns. Some of them will be toxic and unuseful for you. These are called neural pathways, as I've said. These pathways will then become your default thinking. Then what you think will happen to you. When you take people in this world that have succeeded, it's because they have a positive attitude and they persevere until they achieve what they set their mind to. Henry Ford is a very typical example of somebody that did not give up. He always had the positivity. Before his first motor car was developed, he was in very dire circumstances financially. But he persevered because his mind believed in something, and he was able to succeed. So there's your brain. And this is the good news. Your thinking can be changed. We don't have to get stuck in a negative thinking pattern. And this is called neural plasticity. You can develop new ways of thinking, and you can change your life from being anxious, overwhelmed, negative about yourself, I'm no good, I'm useless, I'm hopeless, to positive thinking. And the brain will then be able to default to this new way of thinking. And as a result, your life and your health will improve. Now, in the next talk, I will continue to look at this process. So we'll look at the simple process that you can apply to change your life. Now remember, your mind is the driver. And if your driver can exercise control, you are going to do well. So this is the end of part 3. And I will be presenting part 4 in a week's time. And I look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you for watching. To be continued.